Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Søren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. Hello and welcome to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast hosted by myself, Nathan Dickey. This week, I am very excited to be joined by Marissa Alexa McCool, a 2017 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with 3 degrees in English, anthropology, and cinema and media studies. Marissa is also an LGBT rights activist and speaker. She hosts multiple podcasts, including the Inciting Incident podcast, The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand, and We Too Are Stories. And in the space of 2 years has authored 6 books with a 7th in the works, including The PC Lie and the novels False Start and Voice in the Dark. She also won a 2014 Keystone Award for Excellence in Journalism and co-founded the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative with Callie Wright in 2017. According to her website, Marissa tends to blend her theatrical background and fiery passion for atheism, humanist and secular values, and intersectionality. Welcome to the show, Marissa. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's always, whenever I get asked what it is I do and what I want to plug, I always have to ask, how much time do you have? So nice of you to get that out of the way right up front so I don't have to.
There is a lot more where that came from. 6 books going on 7 in 2 years, host and producer of multiple podcasts, and speaker at several cons across the country every year, also since around 2016. I think a lot of people, including me, might have the question in the back of their minds, how do you do it? How do you find the energy?
Well, a lot of it has to do with how I was accustomed to managing my time. Being a Penn student alone is a very... you have to spend a lot of time making sure that you manage your time efficiently. And I sort of had to do that, but on steroids, because I had a 2-hour commute each direction. And, I had to work. And most people at a college like that don't have to. They have trust funds and rich parents, considering I went to school with a Trump. If that gives you some idea of the economics that I was surrounded by. So the idea of having to produce a high volume of work on a regular basis, by the time I came out, it was already so ingrained that I don't know how to do anything else. I can't break out of that I have to get it all done right now mentality, because that's what I had to do to survive for 4 years in a school that was way out of my depth or training as someone who never passed a year of high school.
It's a testament to your ability and your strength that you were able to do that, to kind of be a self-made person. And I know you've told this story numerous times, but I'd love for my listeners to hear about the catalysts, the turning points that made you who you are today, and specifically speaking about the UPenn campus, your experience confronting the UPenn hate pastor in 2016. I think this is the kind of story that is also an inspiration to a lot of people who feel like they're not in a position to have a voice or don't feel safe having a voice.
I mean, I will never get sick of telling the Pastor Carl story. I mean, that's like probably the coolest thing that will ever happen, because it ended up being caught on video. So anytime anyone tries to be skeptical about it, it's like, nope, here's the tape. I got it. So I feel like I can't tell that story without also saying that there were a couple of events that led to that. The first was that I was named Marissa at 18 before I knew what trans was. And for many years, I considered myself a drag queen only because that was the only word I had. And it wasn't until I was exposed to new information that I really began to realize who I was. And from there, I was starting to come out in 2014. But unfortunately, I was sexually assaulted twice in a week. And that kind of pushed me back down into the numb hiding state for almost 2 years. And it was Pulse that made me decide to start transitioning, although I kept it very low key for a while. And that was because the second name on the list of the victims of Pulse had the last name McCool. And it sort of inspired the thought of, if I had been in that place and I had been lost, 99% of the people in my life would not remember the right person. They would remember a front, a false presentation, something I put out to protect myself. And I could no longer live with that. I couldn't live with being remembered as who I pretended to be safe. Mm-hmm. But I also got on HRT and was stealthing it for a while because I thought I should probably get out of college and move out here to Minnesota as I planned before I decided to be completely public. But another thing that changed that was that I ended up getting full-time custody of my kids, which was one of the major things that kept me in the closet, because the other side of that family is Fox News right-wing fundamentalist evangelical, so I didn't want to give them anything to use against me. So with that out of the way, when I had 100% custody, the barriers were removed. But I was also working in college sports. I was working for a college football team, the one I went to, Penn. And, there's just, I always tell trans people this and queer people this, there's always going to be something that keeps you from coming out, that keeps you from feeling like you're going to be safe. And if you constantly let yourself fall for that, you're going to rob yourself of the time of being authentic. And speaking retrospectively, of course, it's 100% worth it, but it's very hard to convince yourself of that at the time. So on October 5th, 2016, on a common area of our campus, UPenn is downtown Philadelphia, Center City, and there's a public area, despite it being a private college, that's called Locust Walk, and it's really pretty. It's where the administration buildings are. It's where the library is. There's a giant half button that's called the Bent Button, and that's a meetup area for a lot of people because everybody knows where it is, and it's right in front of the library. And for the second time, a man I refer to as Pastor Carl was there. And the first time he was there, I was still under that mentality of, don't protest back against them. That makes you just as bad. It gives them the attention they want, whatever. And this time I couldn't let that go, because not only did he have signs with things like women get out of college and back into the kitchen, but a lot of anti-sexuality signs, anti-women signs, anti-sex in general signs were adorned on the statue of Ben Franklin, the founder of the university. Now, when you go to college for just reading one book, the Bible, you may not learn a lot of things about American history. So I felt I should help him with that, namely being that Ben Franklin would fuck anything with legs. So it was more that I started trolling him for irony, and he didn't know how to handle that because he's used to younger kids who get upset when they're called slurs. I mean, this guy was calling Jewish women slurs. He was calling Muslim women slurs. There was one girl who had exposed shoulders, and she was called a slut and a whore for that. But these are 17 and 18-year-old kids. I'm 31 at this point. I don't give a fuck what this guy has to say. And the more I distracted him, the more I realized if he said stuff to me as opposed to these kids, it was someone else's day he wasn't going to ruin. Because, being in the skeptical community, and I was already podcasting at that point, it's like, I'm prepared for what these guys have to say. I listen to Cogdis and Scathing. Like, I know what they're going to say.
You can learn more about the Bible listening to those two podcasts that you just mentioned than you can going to a fundamentalist Bible church.
Oh, absolutely. Like, even this guy who supposedly graduated from a Bible college, he had passages highlighted in his Bible. And I'm sitting there going, you only went to school for one book. How is it that you don't know it well enough that you have to highlight the passages? Like, and what if the person who made that highlighter was gay? It's a homo highlighter. Maybe it's desecrating your Bible. Maybe you're going to hell. And it was just stuff like that. Just because he's not prepared for that. He's used to just bullying people or people screaming back, but he's not used to sarcasm and irony. And I kept throwing him off that way. So he decided to do a thing. It's like, who has the guts to be judged on the Bible? And I just shot up my hand and I'm like, pick me, Pastor Carl. And I handed the person next to me my phone and said, record this. So he's asking the typical questions like, have you ever drank alcohol? Yes. Oh, you're a drunkard. Have you ever had premarital sex? Yes. Oh, you're a whoremonger. Just overly dramatic. And, he goes through all of them and he says, you know what? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1, you're going to heaven, 10, you're going to hell. You're a 9. You're going to hell, but unlike everybody else here, you're at least honest about it. And I went, you want me to make it a 10? I'm transgender. Fuck you.
That's so epic.
It's probably my favorite story to tell, even today.
So did he give you a 10?
I have no idea. I walked away before he could say anything.
Awesome. That's kind of funny to me that there's a scale of 1 to 10, because on the basis of logic alone, you would think that it would be a 1 or a 2 or a 1 and a 10 and nothing in between. Either you're going to hell or you're not. Yeah. But good luck holding these people up to any kind of logical standard, I guess.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, you have a new book in the works, follow-up to the PC Lie, with the working title, The PC Lie 2, Can We Stop Giving Him a Chance Yet? And it's interesting that everybody instantly knows who you're talking about with the subtitle without having to ask. So let's talk first about what the PC Lie is as you presented it in your first book.
Sure. Well, the PC Lie, the first book I wrote, was shortly after that event. And it was a immediate post-election rant, basically, about 17 essays filled with just concern, anger, rage, and fear of what was going to happen now that Nazis were being emboldened and racists were being emboldened. And fortunately, I was just being paranoid and nothing bad happened like that. But, I put it together and finished it in 9 days. I started the Monday after the election and I was done that quickly. And I got my friend and former Minnesota Vikings punter, Chris Kluwe, to do the foreword. And then I had several other contributors send in essays. I was just like, hey, if you've got something to say about what's going on right now, just send it to me. And I would say it was kind of an overnight thing combined with my coming out video. I went from like 50 podcast listeners to 3,000 pretty much overnight.
Wow.
And all of a sudden I was getting on the shows of people with way more listenership than me. I was on GAM, I was on Scathing, Cogdis. I made my first appearance on Gaytheist. I was getting a lot more attention than I was used to. And the reason is because the book came out before he was inaugurated. So I was like, well, if I don't write the best book about him, at least I'll write the first, it's just kind of getting in the front door. And it's still, I can take all 6 of my books to an event and that one will sell out every time. And I think part of the reason I wanted to write a follow-up is because of that, not because it will make money or anything, but because I feel like I was able to capture a moment in time then. And so much has happened since then that I can't help but at least try to contextualize it.
It feels like it's every single day. Something worse is happening, something bad, something terrible every single day. It's like you wake up and you think to yourself, what terrible thing is going to happen today or has happened during the morning before I woke up today? What scandal, what terrible thing has he said? What terrible thing has he done? And then you go onto the internet to find out.
Well, it's not just that, but it's like, okay, what part of my life is being made illegal today? Because every single month, something happens that involves us. And then, of course, it gets spread around Facebook, which means we'll see the same freaking arguments all over again as if they've never been made before. And, they'll chime in with the I identify as an attack helicopter jokes because they're so fucking clever. But it even feels dated to me at some points when I look back at some of the first stuff I was writing, because I referred to a school shooting in one of my pieces, and I don't even remember what the name of it was because there's so many of them. It was the one where the guy went into the school and shot his girlfriend, the girl he liked, who embarrassed him, and yelled surprise. And I used that to sort of talk about myths and the use of myths in influencing our culture. And I realized by not naming it that it is almost indistinguishable from all the other school shootings, because that's what we live in right now. It's like, yeah, the school shooting, which one? Oh shit, I forgot. Like, it's terrifying.
It is terrifying. Yeah, you have a pretty substantial section in the new book, the draft you sent me, about the power of myth. This is something that really interests me, and it seems to be, even without me meaning to do it, it seems to be a recurring theme that comes up in a lot of my episodes. Sometimes on purpose, like I talked with Dr. Valerie Tarico, a psychologist, about cultural narratives and how she has identified the three most prominent narratives in politics and in social culture generally that we tell ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our surroundings, and how those conflict, how they come into conflict, butt heads. One is, for example, the ancestral story, this conservative, traditionalist vision of the world as being run by men. Men and women have specific roles they're supposed to fit into according to some higher order, whether that be God or some other secular imposing force. And then there are two newer narratives, one being the liberal narrative, and the newest one being a narrative about both the ancestral story, this conservative vision, and this more liberal vision that came along during the Renaissance are both insufficient. We need to tear it all down and build it all back up again. I'm really fascinated by this idea of our lives being informed unconsciously in many ways by stories. We live our lives as if we're living inside a story. Maybe talk about the role myths play and what we mean when we talk about myths.
Well, myths are stories that we use to understand ourselves and each other. And they are pervasive because they can be projected upon. And most myths, especially modern day ones, are projected toward a society that has a supposed universal default of the consumer. And that is usually a cis straight white guy. And I use this not to shame anybody, but to point out that most content has them as the default consumer in mind. And you can tell this by the way that other stories are referred to. Because if a story involves a white guy being wronged and then killing everybody to seek vengeance and or the girl, it's called a movie. If a person does that who is a non-white man, it's generally called something else. Or, as I even say in the speech that I'm working on, movies about white men that kill everybody are called movies. Movies about non-white men that kill everybody are called serial killer documentaries. It's just a matter of seeing how anything that is not projected toward that specific group is seen as subversive or reactionary and labeled as such. If you look at the response to the newest Star Wars, it was so angering toward people who have pretty much every action movie geared toward them to have non-white men in it, that they had to make a version of it that didn't offend them so much because women exist. And and these are the people who call others snowflakes.
Yes, I was going to point out that beautiful or painful irony, maybe it's both beautiful and painful. And I'm sure you heard about, this has been going on for a while, at least the past 5 years or so. When Mad Max Fury Road came out, for example, you might have heard about how the MRAs tried to boycott it because it had a woman who shot guns. And we can't have that. That's kind of threatening to the role we perceive ourselves to hold.
There's numerous examples. And there's also the examples of when cis people play trans roles and that they are completely unable to understand why that bothers us. Not even just beyond that, but then other cis people give them awards for how brave they are to tell our stories. And it's just frustrating that we live in a world where there's so much access to information, but some people refuse to see any of it. So
I wonder if I'm off in making this comparison, but centuries ago in theatrical productions, like in Elizabethan England, or it might have been even before then, I'm not sure how far back, but there was a point in time in the history of theater, when men played the parts of women because women were not allowed to act on stage.
that happened in Shakespearean times.
Mhm.
Romeo and Juliet, younger boys with higher voices would play the female parts. And that was just the shitty aspect of that society, but it shouldn't be a model for how we handle this.
Absolutely. There are these stories that come along, stories that tell things from a different point of view than what people, including myself, people who are privileged in society are used to. We see that with like very recent examples include things like Wonder Woman or Black Panther that just enrage people who are so fragile that they can't stand to see a different kind of story. We have people like Jordan B. Peterson going on stage and saying things like, oh, we need to go back to the archetype of the hero's journey and conquering the chaos, by which he means women. And people view that as, oh my God, he's so brilliant and he's so cutting edge with his academic reinterpretation of all these ancient mythic archetypes. He's just trying to reestablish the status quo.
I specifically do talk about the hero's journey, and I break it down, not in a fully detailed level, but in using tropes. And I'll read a little bit of what I wrote, referring to the hero's journey. And I say, or a bit more specifically, the world is great. Something bad happens to a man. Man goes on adventure. Man makes everything right. And in most cases, man gets girl. Most popularly attributed to Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, this is not only one of the most common and famous plot story structures, but for a very long time was believed to be the only way to make a movie. Now, in these stories, there's a man, usually cis, straight, and let's be honest, white, who lives in a place where things are amazing. Good family, nice town, great life. Then something messes that up. His aunt and uncle are killed while goons look for droids. An evil scientist or millionaire disrupts tranquility in the town. Dad is killed. Girlfriend is kidnapped. Wrong is done. Sometimes to everyone, but usually to one specific white, cisgender, heterosexual young man. And in most of these stories, it is the one man, TM, who must stand up to the giant evil that has caused this disruption. Sure, there are friends who help him along the way, and the girl, always a girl of course, may have to overcome a series of characteristics, but she is ultimately the prize. The one man, TM, defeats every obstacle put before him, no matter how insurmountable the odds may be, until the villain, or to connect it to earlier in my speech, the other, is the last thing that stands between him and justice, revenge, a return to normalcy, and of course the girl. Just as I'm writing that, you're imagining everything from Star Wars to Taken. That's because we have myths, and they are what we have accepted as part of an understanding of our culture. They're ingrained. And how does the one man usually carry out this objective? By taking a gun and murdering absolutely everybody.
That about sums it up. It's just kind of mind-boggling to me that people are so scared of losing that story. I say this, I hope I don't come across as virtue signaling or anything, but even as cis, straight, white male myself, I don't understand it's hard for me to put myself in the shoes of other straight, white, cis men who feel so threatened by news stories, like maybe questioning the foundational assumptions that build up these archetypes, this universally recognizable story that you just described.
Part of it is, and I've seen this in responses a lot, is when not you, but other people who fit that narrative are asked why they don't go see Black Panther or a movie about a trans person or a movie that has, say, an all-black cast or something like that, they'll say, well, because I can't relate to anyone in it or identify anyone with it. And those of us who don't fit that characteristic are sitting there going, yeah, how do you think it feels when we have to do that literally all the time? So it's a matter of being treated like you are the universal default makes you feel like that is what everybody feels like, because you've never had to question it. Because it's like, oh, I'm going to go see Back to the Future. Oh, troubled young white guy struggles to find his voice, and insert that into pretty much any popular movie made before 2015. And then all of a sudden things are different, and you're also being piped full of like, the SJWPC culture is ruining everything and whatever. And it's like, yeah, they're trying to take over my thing. These are my stories. They're how I grew up and interpreted the culture. So it feels like a threat because other people have the nerve to want to be represented.
Yeah, I was in a Barnes & Noble a couple months ago, overheard this middle-aged white man complaining to a captive audience, a younger woman who was working there as an employee. She was directing him to the sci-fi section. He somehow cornered her into a discussion of Star Wars and how he was lamenting the loss of heteronormativity. Obviously, he didn't use a word with as many vowels as that, but he was talking about how, Star Wars used to not be so concerned about multiculturalism. And this woman I could see the pain in her face. She was smiling and nodding, trying to get away. He was saying, what do you think about this? And she's like, well, I can't really talk about it. I work here. So I see this going on just in random conversations I overhear in public. It makes me wonder, you talk about the myth of echo chambers also in this new book. Where do you think this plea for everyone to be against echo chambers really comes from? I suspect that, so on the surface, it sounds like a reasonable argument. You don't want to be exposed only to ideas that you agree with. You want to be challenged so that your own views can be strengthened or revised as needed. But I've noticed this myself too. It feels like every time this argument about echo chambers comes up, it's within a context of people not wanting to question their own privilege. And privilege itself is a buzzword that people don't like, because it feels like when a lot of people, not everybody, but predominantly, it feels like when people talk about echo chambers, it's a way to stop an uncomfortable conversation that they don't want to have. Is this your sense as well?
It's sort of the matter of this belief that the objective experience is the correct one. And when our politics is dominated by that idea, on the surface, it seems like the right one. If we go to the conversation as objective as possible, that we must be therefore more capable of handling it. But when you look deeper a little bit, so many political issues concern another group of people, whether that's people of color, whether it's gay people, trans people, whether it's different minorities or identity groups. And when you are not part of that group, and when you consider them a minority, or to use another buzzword they love, identity politics, it can feel like, it's like, well, I'm coming to this objectively and you're not, you're emotional, you're upset, you only want to hear people who agree with you. And it's like, when you're unable to see beyond your own perspective in that idea, it can feel like someone's getting emotional or is therefore has clouded and biased judgment. And it's like, yeah, because you are discussing my identity as if it's only a thought experiment, because for you it is. Mm-hmm. When we have those discussions, I'll just use trans people as an example. They'll say, well, you can't tune out everyone who disagrees with you. And it's like, well, disagrees with me how? Thinks I should be murdered, thinks I should be put in a mental institution, thinks it's funny to dead name or misgender me, thinks it's funny to treat me like shit. I don't have to tolerate someone's opinion when their opinion is you should be dead. Mm-hmm. When that's not an everyday occurrence for you, when it's not something that you have to deal with anytime you log onto the internet, as I was saying earlier, trying to figure out which rights we're going to lose next, it's hard to understand that you're saying I should hear people out who don't see me as a person. And I'm not willing to do that. So the echo chamber idea there comes up in people saying, you should hear out your bullies. And that, to me, speaks to a high level of lacking empathy.
And isn't it the case that there's a lot of projection going on? Because it seems to me that somebody who's not in my position of privilege, say somebody who's trans, who's gay, who's a person of color, who has to be afraid of being shot for holding a cell phone in their backyard, it seems like they are exposed to, quote unquote, the other side every minute of every day because in many cases, their lives are in danger or their right to exist is being questioned. So it seems like their very existence is being exposed to the other side all the time. And so when somebody says, oh, you should hear out the other side, there's a little bit of projection going on because their experience isn't the same. They might be in a position where they're comfortable hearing out other opinions because they're not being threatened with threats of...
There's no consequence of it.
Right. They don't have to face the same consequences. Yeah.
Exactly. It comes up a lot on social media, especially Facebook, where, oh, you're creating your own echo chamber of whatever, and you only, have people around who agree with you or whatever. And it's like, do you think if I made my Facebook completely lacking transphobes that I would be unaware of their opinions? Like, all I have to do is exist in the world to know their opinions. So the fact that I choose to make my personal Facebook page free of certain things in no way keeps me from knowing what their opinions are.
I mean, look who's president. This is something that everybody has to confront on a daily basis, whether it's the people whose lives are literally being threatened or the people who are their allies. And this brings me to the question of allyship. There are a lot of people who are allies in name only, allies who consider themselves for the cause of less privileged people and minorities and marginalized groups when it's safe. So talk about, for any of my listeners who might be wondering, and this is a question I ask myself often as well, if you're in a position of privilege, how do you avoid the trap of being a performative ally, an ally in name only, who only stands up for people when it's safe to do so? How do you put yourself out there in a way that's authentic if you want to be a true ally?
Well, if something makes you uncomfortable with a marginalized group, and even as a white trans person, I have to do this when I'm talking to, say, trans people of color, because I don't have the same experiences that they do, and therefore have a certain level of privilege even within a minority group. So if something makes you uncomfortable, or if somebody calls you out on something, it's understandable to be immediately defensive. But you have to take a step back and ask if you were doing something that was making them uncomfortable, and at least understand where that person might be coming from. If you're only interested in getting your token ally cookie, you're not doing it for the right reasons. Or if you accuse people of alienating allies for calling someone out on problematic behavior, it's like, well, if me speaking out and criticism is what alienates you, you were never an ally to begin with. It's about being there not just when it's convenient, yes, but it's also about maybe you need to change something. Maybe you need to speak up when we're not around. If somebody's being racist around you because they feel comfortable, that's the time to speak up. It's not just about doing it when a person of color is nearby so that they see you doing the right thing. Or let's just say it's someone who used to know me as the person I pretended to be. And if they're only around you and they start speaking to me with that name or with those wrong pronouns because I'm not around, that's the time to speak up and be an ally, because that's not acceptable. And sometimes it's about being uncomfortable, yes, because you have to speak up at a time where people who with shitty opinions are comfortable around you enough to express them, but then realize that the people in question who are affected by those opinions have to deal with that shit literally all the time. So being an ally is about stepping up when other people aren't around, or when the people in question are so fucking burnt out from having to do it that you stand in their stead and defend them so that they don't have to. With someone like me who is very publicly trans and speaks out a lot, it can get exhausting to have the same argument over and over again or explain the same basic 101 things. And I do, but sometimes I wish I didn't have to. And that is a case where many people on my page will step up and, speak to them because they know I shouldn't have to do it all the time. That's being an ally. It's saying, Marissa shouldn't have to answer this question again. I'm going to speak up because it doesn't require as much emotional energy for me to do so. So it'd be the same as if someone of color was being barraged with the same over and over arguments that we have to hear about police or about all lives mattering. And sometimes it's just about stepping up and going, maybe not bother them with this shit for their emotional labor. Here's some resources, do it yourself, or I'm going to argue so that they don't have to for once. Like it's just about trying to be there for people in that way too.
A lot of times these questions that are directed at people aren't asked in true faith, or they're not asked from a place of actually honestly wanting to learn the answer. And I'm guessing it can be a challenge sometimes, although not always, to tell the difference between somebody who's asking honestly, who's coming from a real place of wanting to learn, and those who are asking in malice.
Well, it's not 100%, but as you do it more often, you begin to pick up on the signs one way or the other. Usually, if someone's asking in good faith, I will take the time, especially when I'm at a conference or something and someone comes up to me with personal questions. I'm more than happy to do that so that the person who doesn't have thousands of people to support them doesn't have to. And that's a place where I have privilege, because if I get wronged, there's a couple thousand people who are going to back me up. And there are trans people, even ones that I know, that don't have 5. So if I can get out there and say certain things and answer certain questions, maybe those kids won't have to. But it's also about recognizing the tactics and the speech patterns. And, there's people who just ask questions, and then there's people who are jacking off, JAQing, just asking questions. And usually those are immediately invasive and skeptical and almost sarcastic. You can usually tell if someone's using slurs or saying things like LOL triggered or, other buzzwords that when you engage in that kind of rhetoric, you're used to seeing. If somebody makes an attack helicopter joke, I immediately know not to take them seriously. So it's just about, there's the old adage, pick your battles. And in a lot of cases, there are people who are just looking to troll. And it gets pretty easy to recognize it when you see it so often. So I try to engage with people who seem genuine, even if they don't agree with me, for the most part. But when I see those signs of someone who's either looking to troll or is coming from a place of malice, it's usually pretty easy to tell. And I will make my judgment call almost immediately, because I don't owe them a response. I don't owe them a space. So I'm not going to give it to someone who is only interested in triggering the libs.
Yeah, and we've alluded a couple times in this discussion to the relevance of experience, that one person's experience is not the same as another's, including among trans people and people of color. So this might be a good place to talk about intersectionality, because this is something that is also a buzzword among both quote-unquote liberals. Liberals, this might be kind of a side tangent, but the word liberals doesn't really describe anymore where somebody stands and doesn't stand, it seems. But among both liberals and conservatives broadly, it seems to be a buzzword that makes for a lot of heated discussions and a lot of confusion. Have you been able to, or can you demystify to an extent what we're talking about when we talk about intersectionality?
You know how you and I are different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to guess that my experience in the world is much different than yours. For an example, if you have to go to the store, does it give you high anxiety that someone might use a slur toward you, or just look at you in a way that's going to make you very uncomfortable?
Not at all.
Exactly. If I go to the store, that's always on my mind, because I have to be vigilant to keep myself safe. That's all intersectionality is. It's acknowledging that people come to the table with different life experiences based on who they are and what they've been through. A lot of people have mistaken it for a hierarchy of minority status or something like that, when really, for the most part, and every concept has people who take it way too far, and I acknowledge that. There are people in the trans community I have to avoid for this particular reason. But if I'll give you an example, at my live episode of Inciting Incident 150, I had two guests of color, and one was talking about what it's like to be sexualized as a Black woman. I do not know what that is like, but I can learn from Mandisa Thomas about what it is like and acknowledge that she probably knows her own experience better than I do. Or we can talk with Alex Jules about police violence and that he, as a Black man, has a very different relationship with police than I would or Bethany would. And it's an acknowledgement and understanding of that I probably shouldn't speak over him when he's talking about that, or tell him that he's wrong about what he's experienced. And really, that's what intersectionality is. It's just those acknowledgments of, I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. I probably shouldn't tell him what his experience is. The same as I wouldn't tell you what it's like to go to the store as a white guy because I don't know. And it's not as complicated or as SJW politically correct, insert buzzword here, that people make it out to be.
I see intersectionality used as kind of a bad word among some certain groups. It does bother me too to see it attacked in academia in some sectors. I was reading Amy Chua's book, Political Tribes, her new book, which just came out. A wonderful book, really breaks down and explains well the idea that with globalization happening, we need to take into account our tribalistic mindsets and look at kind of gear our foreign policy to the understanding that other nations in the world have a completely different understanding of things like, or concepts of like democracy, for example, than we do. Great book, except for when at the end she talks about intersectionality in the context of a chapter about the culture wars in America, as if it was like, she even used the phrase oppression Olympics, which seemed to kind of, it undermines or invalidates what's really going on.
Yeah, and that happens a lot. There are people who respond to marginalized groups expressing their story as an oppression Olympics, as if it's something that they're making up to compete with being marginalized, as if that's some kind of desirable thing. Because when you don't consider the experience of others, and when you think that your way is the only way that anything ever happens, it's understandable, if blatantly incorrect, to think that, oh, well, that's never happened to me, therefore it doesn't happen. So breaking that illusion is a big step toward understanding that your experience of the world is likely not what most people's is.
Exactly. Very well put. I'm wondering if there's a bright side to all this. Is there a reason to be optimistic about not the direction the country is going in currently, because there's nothing to be optimistic about that, but optimistic about the potential to change. Representation in media, for example, is that there seems to be a change stirring, at least, in how other groups besides cis straight white men are being portrayed. I'm wondering if you see any reason to be optimistic or hopeful, maybe not in the Steven Pinker sense of, hey, everything's great already, but what movements or directions do you see that you are happy about or hopeful about?
I appreciate the fact that we are in a world now where independent content creators don't have to get picked up by an agent and put on TV for anybody to know who they are. The ability for people to take it upon themselves to be heard or seen is a great sign, because a lot of people are just going, fuck it, I'm not playing their game, I'm doing it myself. And Callie Wright and I, as you said in the beginning, sort of decided to somewhat unify with other trans podcaster creators to not only have an alliance with each other, but to help others have their voice heard. and help them get started and have an immediate network of support and contact. And I think that gives me the most optimism, as well as the fact that everything going on has made a lot of people who were privileged enough to not have to give a shit start paying attention. There are so many stories of people who said, I never had to care about this until it started affecting me. And while it shouldn't have to affect you for you to care about people, the fact that they are, and that some people are starting to really speak out and get involved, I think is a very good sign. I'm hoping it can happen before it becomes illegal to exist. But there's plenty of reason for optimism, despite I came up with this phrase a couple days ago, and I fully admit it's probably the greatest thing I'm ever going to write. I called it a drumster fire smorgasbord. Like, I might as well quit writing. I am never going to do better than that. But, when you look at it that way, and you see how many people are getting involved, and you see the marches and the protests, and people who are unwilling to just be apathetic in the face of what is going on, there is reason to believe it will get better and that we will see immediate action. We have to constantly warn about the dangers of complacency, or about thinking that the battle is over after one election or anything like that. But it's not unreasonable to have hope that things are going to get better when I see people who never gave a shit a couple of years ago be as aware and involved as they have become. And continuing to do that, I think, will only make people take them more seriously. The more people who speak out and show up, the more likely something is to be heard. And it goes back to my story about Pastor Carl, where I used to be under the illusion that ignoring bullies or people like that made them get bored and leave you alone. No. When a bully like that doesn't get challenged, they get confident. They start gaining more supporters because they're not being countered. They're not being argued against. And people who don't have the ability or position to speak up see them not being countered or protested against. And they lose any hope that that's ever going to happen. And it was kind of a microcosm of the Trump election, because not enough people took it seriously. And they thought, if we just ignore it, he'll go away. And he didn't. And I'm hoping that was enough proof for those people that just standing by and letting someone talk and say horrifically racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic things, just ignoring them doesn't work. And just writing off all of their supporters as, idiots is not the way to handle it. It's important to speak up and speak out against bad ideas. It's important to take action and not just think that something's going to go away because you find it absurd or laughable.
I was also going to make the connection to Trump's election, because the morning after that election, everybody was just in an utter state of shock. Like, what the fuck just happened? And it took a while to get over that initial shock. And then it took a little more time after that to realize, we need to get our shit together and to start calling things out that need to be called out, and not take progressive values for granted as if most people just are on board with us.
And I had a unique experience with that myself, because I went to the school that Trump went to. And Tiffany Trump was a class ahead of me. So I was right in the middle of a lot of that. Like, for instance, every school that played us in football had a halftime show that mocked Trump. And there was always media on campus talking about it. So it's like everything that was going on that people experienced during that election, we were in the middle of all of it, because everybody always wanted to know what we thought. And he constantly spoke about what school he went to, so we were associated with it. So I think part of the reason I was able to write that initial book is because I had a front row seat to most of that section of the election. And just to say that I don't just say things and not do them, my first book was a piece of, I need to speak up, I need to speak out, and I need to do it now. So I don't just say things that I believe without also living up to the expectations I set.
And I think one reason your first book caught on the way it did is because I think it spoke to people. I think we need stuff like that, even more than the dry, removed academic treatments of Trump. Those have their uses.
Yeah, the first words of that book were "fuck you." So I mean, you know what you're getting when you turn to the first chapter.
But I think people really need that emotional, on the moment, on the spot reaction, and not just reaction, but just the bearing of the soul in response to something terrible that is happening. I think people really connect to that pathos and that ethos, whatever the right word there to use is. People need emotion. People need to feel something. And I think you probably spoke for and continue to speak for a lot of people who feel what you're saying but don't have that voice. So I hope you continue writing. And on that note, do you have any more fiction planned? Because your fiction is also something that I really admire, and the way you feature representation of misunderstood groups. So do you have any future plans for more novels?
Absolutely. It's just not as easy as nonfiction comes to me. I'm even going back to grad school to do creative nonfiction, but I will be having a secondary study in fiction because while it is a lot harder for me to create content, there has been a very positive response to the novels that I write. And I also try to not make it a point of everything is represented here for the sake of it. I try to tell a story that people can relate to while also seeing certain identities represented. The second novel I wrote, for instance, Voice in the Dark, has a trans character, but it's not instrumental to the plot that the character is trans. And that's where I think we need to get to, where someone isn't the Black character, or it's not the focus that they are a Black character, or a Latinx character, or a trans character, or a gay character, where it's just, oh, that character's whatever, great. Like, that's what I try to create. And in both cases, the way I write fiction is that I use very little visual identifiers of the people in the story, because I want people of any background to be able to project a little bit themselves or people they know onto these characters. So I don't identify the characters in certain ways unless they need to be. Like if, False Start, the love interest is a trans woman. So that matters. But I don't say, what they look like, because I feel like if I don't fill in those spaces, it gives more people a chance to fill them in themselves. And that might seem antithetical to some issues of representation, and I admit on some level it is. But I feel like if I can write stories that appeal to more than just a certain kind of people, that they'll be more universally accepted.
Absolutely. That makes complete sense to me. So I guess on that note, is there anything, this is kind of a vague, weird question I throw out there. I tend to throw out to most of my guests at the end of every interview. Is there any parting words of wisdom or anything you want to say as a parting message coming off of this podcast to any of my listeners?
Sure. First of all, assholes are not exclusive to any group. So you are going to encounter people in marginalized communities that you don't like. And that's okay. There are trans people I don't like and choose not to spend time with. But it's not a reason to hold your ally card hostage. Marginalized groups have no obligation to be nice to you. If they're in a position where they're educating or when they're speaking out, it's probably better to do so, to be accessible, but they don't have to. So if someone makes you uncomfortable, especially if they're speaking from a place of marginalization or oppression or anything else, at least try to figure out what it is that makes you uncomfortable. Get to the root of what it is. Sometimes if someone's never met a trans person before, if I keep asking why, I'll eventually get to the root cause. And sometimes it's because they've had feelings like that before and not known how to process them. So when you're in that position, figure out why it is that you're uncomfortable. And it may take a while, but try to look past the surface and say, what is it about what this person is saying or doing that makes me feel uncomfortable or defensive. And pay attention to that. It doesn't mean you have to agree with the person. It doesn't even mean that that person's right. But if they're coming at it from a perspective of their own experience, and they might have challenged something that you previously thought was true or fair or right, at least consider that. At least consider that they might have experienced the world much differently than you did. And that's okay. And you don't have to agree or give everyone that space, but at least figure out what it is that disturbed you and try to learn from it.
Very well put. And in closing, where can people find you and your work if they're interested?
I have a website, rismccool.com. That's RISMCCOOL. And all my books and podcasts are there, the Inciting Incident podcast and the Sister Getting Out of Hand, as well as the other podcasts that I produce. My husband's podcast, FTM for Trans Men. I just stopped producing Secular Soup because they decided to go out on their own, which is fine. I produce Beyond Gender. I produce Man Yells at News. So I try to help out other people who are getting into podcasting, and it's been a fun ride. You can find me on all the social medias, either under Marissa Alexa McCool or Marissa Alexa Lennox McCool, because my partner and I will be consummating our partnership, and we decided
congratulations.
Thank you. Aiden fully supports it, and we will be having a ceremony, even though we can't do it legally, and all three of us intend to have our last name be Lennox McCool, because we all live together and we're all family.
Awesome.
And I also, if anybody wants to help, I am getting my science vagina in 39 days now, as of this recording, and I have a fundraiser to help my family with certain costs that come with that, because I was dealing with a lot of transphobia at work, and I wasn't being supported, and I eventually got pushed out because of it. So it's really difficult to find a job when you have to say, well, in a month, I'm going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. So I have that available as well if anybody feels like helping me out during this time. So that's pretty much what I'd like to promote.
Awesome. I will have links to everything, including that GoFundMe. Thank you very much for your time. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
As did I. And I appreciate the conversation as well as your friendship. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussion this show is meant to encourage, you can find the official discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/A Leap of Doubt. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @TheNatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The opening and ending music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. The audio was edited by Rich Lyons of the Living After Faith podcast. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/A Leap of Doubt.